Expedia and Visit Scotland invite you to come experience the beauty that awaits in Scotland. The sweep of wild coastlines, quiet lochs, and untamed landscapes. Fresh cuisine that feels rooted in the land. Come experience the kind of stillness that stays with you long after you leave. Plan your Scottish escape today at expedia.com/Visit Scotland.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
You're listening to Unbound presents Until They Wake. 7 episodes, 6 lives, 1 impossible convergence. Beth Curry's been chasing these stories for a while now, and she's finally ready to share what she found. It's not what you'd expect. Nothing about this is. Pull up a chair. This one's different.
Hey everyone, I'm Beth Curry, and most of you know I have a forensics background, which means I've spent a lot of time looking at the evidence people leave behind. The physical kind, yes, but also the other kind, the kind that you kind of carry with you after something happens and it kind of changes everything. This is called Until They Wake. It's a 7-part series that I've been sitting on for a little while now. So it's 6 stories and it's 6 people. And there's one question threading through all of them that will make a lot more sense by the time we get to the end. These aren't your typical near-death experience stories. There's no tunnels of light and no celestial waiting rooms. What I want to talk about is what comes after. The lives that people build in the wake of a moment that changed them, and kind of that strange, persistent feeling, that you get. The questions that don't really resolve. I've been into this. I've not been into it. I've been in this particular situation a couple of times. And before I get into it all, I just want to share something meaningful to me. If you listen to the Dangerous Mind series, you know this story already. The opening and closing music has kind of a story behind it. And at the end of episode 7, I'll close out the series with a song in its entirety instead of just the portions that fit what my sound engineer opts to use for my intro and outro. So this special series features a unique musical collaboration that spans nearly a decade. The foundation is an original solo guitar recording by Jeremy. If you know me well, you know of him. And it's from 2017. And he recorded it, as he often did, recording his covers and his own stuff and everything. And in 2026, Nate transformed it into a full 3-minute composition, layering in his own piano and drum performances to create an entirely new piece inspired by Jerry's original. And the finished song, named Sea Smoke, for me, is pretty much a collaboration across time. And I think it's pretty special. These 2 guys who have always meant a lot to me from near and far created a song that I have the privilege of using for this series. So today's story starts at a lake in September 1995. A swim instructor, a 10-year-old boy, and 4 minutes that nobody who was there has ever, fully been able to explain. So James Cooper spent 20 years teaching people not to be afraid of water. He worked at a community center, just like a neighborhood pool, where the smell of the chlorine kind of hits you before the door even opens all the way. Damp tiles, lane lines that had probably seen better days. Not glamorous, but it was his space. His purpose. Definitely the thing he got up for. His own introduction to water hadn't been a controlled environment. His father taught him to swim in Lake Harmon when he was 6, like real water, dark water, the kind where you can't see the bottom and it's really, really cold and there's no lane lines and no lifeguards hovering, just kind of a man and his son in a lake that didn't really give a shit how old you were. His father always said that the lake would teach you what a pool never can. And James believed that, and he carried it into every lesson he ever taught. Water's not something you conquer. It's something you negotiate with. It's something you learn to read. And he used to tell his students that people who spend their whole lives fighting water never really learn to swim, right? They just learn to not drown. And the way he said it made clear that those things were two entirely different things. By 1995, he was married. Her name was Sarah, and she had actually been one of his students, a 32-year-old woman who made it to adulthood without ever learning to swim and had finally decided she was done sitting on the side of the pool at pool parties, with her family or whatever. It took 6 months of private lessons, and she never became graceful in the water. James used to say she moved through it like she was negotiating with it, but she became confident, and somewhere in those 6 months, between teaching her to float and helping her master the front crawl, they fell in love, of course. She proposed to him in the shallow end of the community center pool, both of them treading water, her mascara running. And she told him he'd taught her that, she wouldn't drown. And he said yes. They'd been married 3 years by September of 1995. No kids yet, but James had something close in a student named Tommy. And Tommy was 10 years old. He was small for his age. He had black hair that kind of stuck up in the back. He'd been placed in James's intermediate class by some administrator who clearly hadn't watched the kids swim. Tommy he could barely make it across the pool, really. After the first week, James pulled him aside and told him straight he knew he was in the wrong class. Tommy already knew, even though he was a kid. So James offered him private lessons. And when it became clear his mother couldn't afford them, James did them for free. Sarah gave him the look she always gave him when he did things like that, like too soft, too generous, always giving more than anyone asked for. But she never argued. She knew who she'd married, right? Tommy turned out to be one of those kids with a natural feel for water that you either have or you don't. Something instinctive, something that can't really be taught. And within months, he was thriving. Within a year, James figured he'd be ready for the swim team, maybe competitive swimming down the line if he wanted it. During one lesson, Tommy asked him if he'd ever been scared of the water. James told him that everyone is at first. The trick is deciding that the water's not your enemy, right? Tommy thought about that for a second, kind of bobbing in the shallow end, and said he'd already decided that, but James agreed and told him he thought so too. This was in late August. Things were good. Tommy was progressing. Sarah was happy. James was doing the thing he'd spent his whole life doing. On September 14th, 1995, this is the point of the story. It was one of those late summer days where the heat hadn't quite gotten the message yet. The air felt thick with July, even though fall was right around the corner, right? Tommy convinced his mom to let him go to Lake Harmon with some neighborhood kids, the same lake where James's father had taught him to swim 3 decades earlier. There were 8 kids total. They were chaperoned by somebody's older brother who was barely 18 himself. Tommy had asked James if he wanted to come. His face was hopeful, but James had back-to-back lessons at the center until 6 o'clock, and he told Tommy next time, have fun, and reminded him about lake swimming. The water's colder, there's no visibility, there might be currents, stay close to shore, don't swim alone, those kinds of things. Tommy saluted him and grinned and headed out, and that was about 2 o'clock that afternoon. At 4:47, someone's mother called 911. The kids had been playing on the old dock, one of those docks that, everyone knows is rotting and dangerous, but nobody's ever really gotten around to tearing it down or rebuilding it or fixing it. It's just kind of always been there. Tommy went in for one more swim before they packed up to leave, and he'd been careful all afternoon, staying in the shallow areas and doing everything right. But 10-year-olds are 10-year-olds. And somewhere along the way, someone decided to swim out to the rope swing. It was probably 30 yards from the dock. Tommy was a strong swimmer by then. On paper, he could have made it without breaking a sweat. He didn't account for the drop-off. One moment, he was in 8 feet of water, and the next, the lake floor just disappeared beneath him. 20 feet, 30, 40. The temperature dropped like someone had opened a freezer door underwater. If you've ever been in a lake like that, you know exactly what that cold does to you, right? It doesn't just chill you. It seizes up your muscles, and it interrupts the signals your brain is trying to send to your body. And it turns swimming, like even good swimming, even practiced swimming, into something that suddenly requires everything you have and then some. And of course, Tommy panicked. The other kids said he went under once and he came back up. He called for help and then he went under again. By the time the 18-year-old chaperone realized what was happening and dove in after them, Tommy had been down for nearly 2 minutes. James was in the middle of a backstroke lesson when his pager went off. He recognized Sarah's number and called back from the office phone. He knew from the first words she said that there had been an accident. The lake was 20 minutes away. James made it in 12. The ambulance was already there when he arrived. It was parked in the dirt lot. Lights going, a crowd had gathered near the dock. Parents had rushed over. Kids were crying. Someone's grandmother was holding a child who couldn't stop shaking. James pushed through all of it, and he found Tommy on the shore. The paramedics had pulled him out and were working on him, doing chest compressions, breaths, all that kind of stuff that they're trained to do. Tommy's skin had a bluish tint to it. His lips were purple. He looked smaller than James had ever seen him. Wet swim trunks, a Ninja Turtles t-shirt plastered to his chest. James didn't think, he just moved. One moment he was standing on the shore, and the next he was waist deep in the lake swimming out towards the rope swing. Someone shouted at him to come back. He didn't. He needed to see where it happened. He needed to understand it. The drop-off was exactly where he had expected it to be. He could feel it, that place where the bottom vanishes. He dove down, eyes open in the murky water, and his lungs burned and the cold wrapped around him. And when he surfaced, gasping, the ambulance was pulling away. Someone told him that they'd got Tommy's heart started again, and he coughed up water and he was breathing and he was going to be okay. He doesn't know what compelled him to get into the water and see what happened and where. James climbed out of the lake shaking. Someone's jacket was put around his shoulders, and Sarah appeared and pulled him toward the car. He sat in the hospital waiting room, dripping lake water onto the linoleum while Tommy's mother held her rosary so tight her knuckles went white and prayed in a voice too quiet to hear. 4 minutes underwater, maybe longer. The doctors said that brain damage was almost certain. Tommy woke up 6 hours later. He knew his name, he knew his mother, he asked for a glass of water and complained that the hospital bed was uncomfortable. The doctors could not explain it. The years after that Thursday are where the story gets interesting. So Tommy made a full recovery. Better than full, he went on to swim competitively in high school. He broke records at state championships. He earned a full athletic scholarship. James went to every meet he could. Sarah would pack sandwiches and they'd drive to whatever school or aquatic center was hosting, and James would stand in the bleachers feeling proud. He was proud. But there was something else sitting alongside it that he had trouble naming. He kept teaching at Riverside Community Center. Same pool, same smell, same kids who were afraid of water and then weren't. And Sarah and James bought a house. It was small. It was near the center. Big yard, big garden. They talked about kids in that kind of vague someday way that couples do when they're not quite ready for the answer to be yes. Tommy graduated high school and came by the center in person to tell James. He showed him the acceptance letter, full ride, said it was all because of James. And James told him it was all because of Tommy, that he'd just taught him the basics. Tommy said he'd taught him more than that. He mentioned that he didn't remember the accident. He remembered going under. And he remembered the hospital, and everything in between was just gone. But people had told him that James dove in after he got out. And neither one of them really knew why. Updates kept coming through the years. College swim team, student athlete of the year, graduated with honors, engaged to a woman he met at swim meet. James went to the wedding in 2009. Small ceremony lakeside, a different lake, clearer and safer. Sarah held his hand during the vows. James cried, which surprised him because he wasn't usually a crier. Sarah asked if he was okay. He said he was proud, and that was true. It just wasn't the whole of it. Time kept moving the way it does. Sarah's hair started going gray at the temples. James turned 50, then 55. Tommy had 2 daughters, born 3 years apart. And when they were old enough to be brought to the center, he took them and asked if James would teach them to swim. And James did, because he was still doing it. 2 little girls with their father's ease in the water, who called him Mr. Cooper. No matter how many times he told them they could just call him James. He taught them everything he knew. Then on a Tuesday morning in 2015, 20 years after Lake Herman, James got the call. Tommy's oldest daughter, Emma, had been in a car accident. She was 7 years old. A driver ran a red light and hit the car she was in. She was at Springfield General. Tommy's voice on the phone was barely there, and he asked if James could come. James was already reaching for his keys. Sarah drove. James' hands were shaking too badly. They didn't talk much. On the 40-minute drive, there wasn't anything that needed to be said. Springfield General is one of those hospitals kind of built in layers, additions and renovations stacked on top of each other across decades. They're building a kind of record of every era it survived. Main entrance, linoleum floors, fluorescent lights, antiseptic, and cafeteria food. They found Tommy in the pediatric wing, his wife, his younger daughter, Tommy's mother, who looked exactly as she had 20 years ago, except for the white in her hair. They were waiting for Emma to come out of surgery. She had a fractured pelvis, internal bleeding. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. James stayed through the afternoon. Sarah brought coffee from the cafeteria. Tommy's mother prayed. They waited. Emma came through fine, better than fine. By evening, she was awake, asking for ice chips and complaining about the IV in her arm. Recovery would take months, the doctor said, but she was going to be okay. Tommy walked James out when visiting hours ended. His face was the face of a man who just exhaled something he'd been holding for 8 hours. He thanked James for coming. James said, of course. Tommy pulled him into a hug and said he wouldn't be there without him, that Emma wouldn't be here, that none of it happens if James hadn't saved his life. James didn't correct him this time either. He said goodnight. Tommy headed back to his family, and then James was alone in the corridor. The elevator bank was to his left. The sign said so, but somehow he turned right instead, and then right again through a door that deposited him into a hallway he didn't recognize. He told himself he just got turned around. Big hospital, long day, easy enough to do. He found a stairwell, followed it down, pushed through a door at the bottom, and walked out into the cold air and headed home. So that's James Cooper's story. Tomorrow I'm going to tell you about a woman named Ruth Mitchell. This took place in November 1987. There was a car crash on a rainy highway, a pregnancy, and 28 years of a life she built around a night that changed everything. These stories are connected. You will see how soon. Thanks for listening.
That's it for this episode of Until They Wake. Unbound is free to listen to. If you'd like to support production costs or get in touch with Beth, check the show notes for details. See you next time.